The blue lights hit your rearview mirror out of nowhere. Your stomach drops before you even realize your foot came off the gas. You look around, wondering if you drifted over the line, missed a sign, rolled the stop too slowly, or maybe did absolutely nothing wrong at all. Then the officer steps out of the cruiser slowly, one hand near the belt, flashlight pointed directly into your vehicle, even though your registration sticker is already visible from 20 feet away. And right there, before a single word is spoken, most drivers already make their first mistake. Have you ever been pulled over and later realized the officer was trying to get you to say something against yourself without you even noticing it at the time? Tell me what happened in the comments, because a lot of people don't realize how subtle these interactions really are until afterward. And stick with this all the way through, because later I'm going to explain one of the most misunderstood moments during a traffic stop that causes ordinary drivers to accidentally give police legal permission to search their car without even realizing they just did it. A traffic stop is one of the strangest interactions in American life because it feels casual on the surface, but legally, it's one of the most controlled situations you can be in without actually being under arrest. That's what throws people off. Drivers think they're having a conversation. Officers often see it as an investigation from the very first second. And whether people want to hear this or not, police officers are trained observers. They are watching far more than your license and registration. They're watching your breathing, your hands, your eye movement, how fast you answer questions, whether your story changes, whether you look overly prepared, whether you appear too calm, too nervous, too talkative, too defensive, too cooperative, or strangely silent. That's why so many people leave traffic stops saying the same thing afterward. I don't even know how things escalated. Because escalation usually doesn't happen all at once. It happens through tiny little moments that seem harmless while they're happening. An officer walks up and says, "Hey, how are you tonight?" Most people instantly start talking. "Good, officer. Sorry, I'm just trying to get home. Long day at work." Seems innocent, right? But now the officer is already analyzing your speech patterns. Are your words slurred? Are you overly apologetic? Are you talking too much? Are your hands shaking while reaching for your wallet? Did you immediately admit distraction or fatigue? Did you volunteer extra information nobody asked for? Drivers constantly underestimate how much information they give away voluntarily. One of the oldest tactics during a stop is simple conversational pressure. Officers often ask questions they already know the answer to, just to see how you respond. They may already know where the registered owner lives. They may already know the vehicle crossed lanes. They may already know the speed from radar. The question isn't always about information. Sometimes it's about reactions. "Where are you coming from tonight?" Sounds casual, sounds harmless. But now your brain shifts into explanation mode instead of protection mode. You start feeling silence because silence feels uncomfortable. Human beings naturally want to reduce tension, especially with authority figures. That's where people begin talking themselves into trouble. "I was just at my friend's house." "What friend?" My buddy Mike." "Where does Mike live?" Now you're in a chain conversation you never intended to enter. And if your answers become inconsistent because you're nervous, tired, or simply trying to remember details under pressure, officers may start treating ordinary hesitation as suspicious behavior. A lot of drivers don't understand this part. Nervousness itself is not proof of criminal activity. But officers routinely document nervous behavior in reports because courts often allow it to contribute toward reasonable suspicion when combined with other observations. So the driver who thinks, "I'll just explain everything and look cooperative," sometimes accidentally creates a bigger investigative situation than necessary. Now let's clear up something important because there's a dangerous myth floating around online. Some people think acting aggressive about rights automatically protects them. It usually does the opposite. There's a major difference between asserting rights calmly and performing rights emotionally. A calm driver says, "Officer, I'd prefer not to answer questions." An emotional driver says, "I know my rights, you can't ask me that." Those situations go very differently in real life. Tone matters more than people realize. Officers are human beings operating in uncertain environments. Every traffic stop carries risk from their perspective. They don't know who they're approaching. They don't know whether someone is armed, intoxicated, wanted, panicking, or preparing to run. That doesn't mean officers are always right, far from it. But understanding how police think gives you a practical advantage. If your goal is getting home safely and avoiding unnecessary escalation, Emotional confrontations usually hurt more than they help. Another thing drivers misunderstand is silence. Silence is legally protected in many contexts, but silence also changes the atmosphere of a stop instantly. The moment you stop casually chatting, officers often become more investigative because the interaction no longer feels socially normal. That's why many officers continue asking questions after someone says they don't want to discuss details. Why don't you want to answer? Do you have something illegal in the car? If you're not doing anything wrong, why not cooperate? This is psychological pressure, and it works surprisingly often because people hate awkward silence. The average person starts talking just to escape tension. That's exactly why pauses become powerful during traffic stops. A short silence feels enormous when red and blue lights are flashing behind you. And here's where people accidentally trap themselves. Officers frequently ask layered questions designed to produce contradictions. Do you know why I stopped you? This question catches people constantly. If you answer, was I speeding? You just admitted the possibility you were speeding. If you say, I wasn't speeding, but radar says otherwise, now the officer may interpret your answer as deceptive. But if you say, no officer, you avoid volunteering information. Simple, calm, minimal. Notice the pattern here. The safest responses during traffic stops are usually short, respectful, and controlled. Not argumentative, not overly friendly, not nervous rambling, controlled. Because once drivers become emotional, they stop thinking strategically. One of the most overlooked moments in a traffic stop happens when officers return to the vehicle after checking documents. Most drivers mentally relax too early. They think the stop is basically over. That's often when questioning changes. You mind if I ask you a few more questions? That sentence matters. A lot of people don't realize the legal nature of the stop may be shifting right there. The original purpose of the stop might already be complete, but officers sometimes continue fishing for consent, admissions, or nervous reactions. Then comes the classic line, "You don't have anything illegal in the vehicle, do you?" Think carefully about the psychology behind this question. Innocent people often laugh nervously, over-explain, or start defending themselves aggressively. No, of course not. You can check if you want. And there it is, consent. Voluntary consent is one of the biggest ways drivers surrender protections during traffic stops. Officers do not always need a warrant if consent is freely given. And many people give consent because they think refusing automatically makes them look guilty. But legally, refusing consent is not itself proof of a crime. That said, reality is more complicated than internet slogans. If an officer already has probable cause or develops reasonable suspicion through other observations, refusing consent may not stop a search anyway. But voluntarily agreeing removes an important legal barrier immediately. This is why wording matters so much. A calm statement like, "I do not consent to searches," is very different from physically resisting or becoming confrontational. Never physically interfere during a stop, ever, even if you believe a search is unlawful. Roadside arguments rarely end the way drivers imagine they will. Courts exist for legal disputes later. The roadside is not where force battles get solved. And here's something people rarely talk about honestly. Officers sometimes intentionally create conversational confusion around consent. You don't mind if I take a quick look, right? Notice how socially awkward refusal suddenly feels. Human beings are conditioned to avoid appearing rude. That tiny phrase, "you don't mind," psychologically pressures compliance. Drivers often answer reflexively, I guess. That uncertain response may still become documented as consent. Now let's talk about body language, because this changes traffic stops dramatically. Imagine two drivers. The first driver is reaching around frantically before the officer even approaches. Glove box opening, backpack moving, seat shifting, console opening and closing. The officer sees movement without context, instant tension. The second driver keeps both hands visible, waits calmly, and only reaches for documents when instructed. Completely different atmosphere. People forget officers approach vehicles with incomplete information and heightened alertness. Sudden movements immediately increase suspicion and caution. Another common mistake happens when passengers start talking. Passengers sometimes think they're helping. "Officer, he wasn't even speeding. He's just nervous. We were only gone for like 20 minutes. Now there are multiple voices, inconsistent details, rising tension, and uncontrolled conversation. Officers often separate questioning between drivers and passengers specifically to compare stories. And innocent people absolutely do contradict each other under pressure. One says they stopped for food, another says they stopped for gas first. Tiny inconsistency. Suddenly officers become more interested. You have to understand how police interviews work psychologically. Investigators are trained to look for deviation, hesitation, uncertainty, and contradiction because guilty people often display those behaviors. The problem is, innocent people display them too when stressed. That's why composure matters more than perfection. A huge mistake drivers make is trying too hard to appear innocent. Over-explaining can look suspicious. Forced friendliness can look suspicious. Overacting calmness can look suspicious. There's no magic personality that guarantees smooth interactions. But controlled communication reduces unnecessary complications. And here's another reality people don't like discussing. Some officers absolutely use intimidation tactics during stops. Long silences, repeated questioning, standing quietly at the window waiting for you to keep talking. Sudden changes in tone. One moment friendly, next moment cold and sharp. Step out of the vehicle. That command changes the emotional temperature instantly. Most people feel panic the moment they hear it, even though officers in the United States generally have broad authority to order drivers out during lawful traffic stops. And the way drivers react in that moment matters enormously. Some people immediately become confrontational. Why do I have to get out? Am I under arrest? You have no right. Now tension escalates physically and emotionally at the same time. A calmer approach is understanding that stepping out itself does not automatically mean you're being arrested. Officers may do it for visibility, control, safety, investigation, or observation. But once outside the vehicle, officers often gain additional opportunities to observe behavior. Balance issues, odor, eye movement, clothing bulges, hand tremors, aggression, compliance. Everything becomes easier to observe outside the car. And this is where another common trick appears. The casual separation tactic. Hey, stand over here for me. Now you're physically separated from your vehicle, while another officer may visually inspect the interior from outside. Drivers often don't even realize observation is intensifying. An officer shining a flashlight into your car at night is generally not some magical violation by itself. If contraband or evidence is openly visible from lawful vantage points, that can change the situation quickly. People confuse private vehicle with absolute privacy. Legally, vehicles receive lower privacy protections than homes in many situations. That surprises a lot of drivers. Another moment where people get trapped is the repeated question technique. Where are you headed? You answer. 3 minutes later, another officer asks again. People get irritated. I already told the other officer. Yes, they know. Sometimes repetition tests consistency. Sometimes it measures emotional reaction. Sometimes officers are independently gathering observations. Sometimes they genuinely didn't hear. But repeated questioning often has strategic purpose. And exhausted drivers make mistakes under repetition, especially late at night, especially when scared, especially when they start trying too hard to sound believable. Now let's address one of the biggest misunderstandings during traffic stops. The idea that being nice guarantees safety. Not necessarily. Politeness helps. Calmness helps. Respect helps, but none of those things override legal realities or officer discretion. At the same time, hostility almost always makes situations worse. So drivers end up in this difficult middle ground where they need to remain respectful without surrendering unnecessary information. That balance is harder than people think, because officers are skilled conversational managers. They redirect topics smoothly. You seem nervous. Now the driver starts defending nervousness. I'm always nervous around cops. Interesting statement. Why is that? Now the conversation expands again. And notice something important here. Most drivers are not trained for high-pressure questioning. Officers are. That imbalance matters. People imagine they'll stay composed until authority pressure actually lands on them in real time. Red lights flashing, traffic moving past, adrenaline rising, hands shaking while finding registration papers. That's why preparation matters before the stop ever happens. Even simple things reduce tension enormously. Knowing where your documents are, keeping your movements visible, avoiding sudden reaching, lowering windows adequately at night, turning interior lights on when appropriate. These little details influence the officer's perception immediately. Now here's a controversial point some people won't like hearing. Many drivers accidentally create suspicion by acting based on bad internet advice. Videos online love showing dramatic roadside confrontations because controversy gets views. But edited clips rarely show full legal outcomes afterward. Real-world consequences matter more than viral moments. A person screaming constitutional phrases while refusing basic lawful commands may feel empowered in the moment, but still end up detained, arrested, injured, or facing expensive legal battles later. Rights matter, absolutely, but strategic behavior matters too. One of the smartest things drivers can learn is emotional discipline, because police pressure often works by speeding people up mentally. Fast questions, fast decisions, fast emotional reactions. Slow yourself down. Not physically slow in a threatening way, mentally slow. Listen carefully, answer carefully, avoid volunteering unnecessary details, and pay attention to transitional moments during the stop, because those are where many traps appear. For example, the officer hands back your license. Most people think they're free to go immediately. Then comes, "Hey, one more thing." That phrase matters. Some courts analyze whether a reasonable person would feel free to leave at that point. But average drivers don't analyze legal nuance under stress. They just stay psychologically trapped in the interaction. Then questioning resumes casually. "Mind if I ask what's in the backpack? Mind if I run the dog around the vehicle real quick? Mind opening the trunk?" Notice how requests are framed conversationally rather than commandingly. That's intentional, because voluntary cooperation creates fewer legal obstacles. And here's another subtle tactic people miss completely. Officers sometimes downplay seriousness intentionally. "This won't take long. We're just trying to clear things up. If everything's good, you'll be on your way." Those statements psychologically encourage continued cooperation because they imply quick resolution. Drivers begin thinking compliance equals faster release. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it opens entirely new investigations. There's also the issue of document retention, which creates huge confusion. Some officers continue holding licenses or registration while asking additional questions. Why does that matter? Because many people reasonably do not feel free to leave without their identification documents returned. So even when questioning sounds casual, the practical reality may still feel coercive to the driver. And people under perceived detention often keep talking simply because they feel trapped. Now let's discuss vehicle searches more deeply, because this area confuses almost everyone. Drivers often think police need a warrant for every car search. Not true. Vehicle exceptions under US law are broad compared to home searches. Probable cause, visible contraband, certain arrests, inventory procedures, consent, and other circumstances can legally justify searches depending on facts and jurisdiction. That's why controlling what you voluntarily reveal matters so much. Odor claims become major issues during stops too. An officer saying they smell marijuana, alcohol, or narcotics can dramatically change the legal situation. Whether those claims are accurate or disputed later becomes complicated. And remember, officers are documenting everything mentally from first contact. Bloodshot eyes, air fresheners, energy drinks, fast food wrappers, open containers, prescription bottles. Even innocent details can become part of a broader suspicion narrative when combined together. That's why drivers should stop assuming investigations begin only after accusations appear. Investigations often begin the second emergency lights activate. Another thing people misunderstand is how fatigue affects roadside decisions. Late-night stops are psychologically brutal. Your brain slows down, your emotional control weakens, your speech becomes less precise. And officers know impaired drivers are statistically more common at night, so observations become even more scrutinized. That's why some innocent drivers unintentionally appear suspicious simply because they're exhausted and stressed. Now imagine this scenario. The officer asks, "Have you had anything to drink tonight?" The driver panics internally because they had one beer at dinner 3 hours ago. Should they lie? Dangerous idea. Should they over-explain? Also risky. Because once drivers begin rambling defensively, officers often interpret behavior itself as suspicious, regardless of quantity admitted. And this is exactly why traffic stops feel psychologically uneven. Officers control pace, location, positioning, and questioning structure. Drivers react. That reactive state creates vulnerability, especially when officers interrupt repeatedly. Just answer yes or no. People become flustered quickly when they lose conversational control. Then come the mistakes, contradictions, voluntary admissions, emotional outbursts, nervous jokes, sarcasm, attempts to sound clever. One sarcastic comment can completely alter the officer's tone. People underestimate how fast mood shifts during roadside interactions. A stop that begins relaxed can become aggressive in seconds depending on perceived threat, disrespect, evasiveness, or officer temperament. And yes, sometimes officers push boundaries. Sometimes they bluff. Sometimes they imply authority broader than what legally exists. That reality makes calm awareness even more important. For example, officers may ask for consent in ways that sound mandatory. "Open the trunk for me." That phrasing sounds like a command, even when legal consent is actually being sought. Drivers who don't understand the difference often comply automatically. But there's another side to this conversation too. Some drivers become so focused on winning the interaction that they forget the immediate goal is safe resolution. You are not going to litigate constitutional law successfully on the shoulder of a highway at midnight. The roadside is a terrible courtroom, and one of the biggest mistakes people make is believing every officer interaction follows the exact same pattern. It doesn't. Some officers are calm professionals, some are suspicious immediately, some are conversational, some are confrontational, some de-escalate naturally, some escalate quickly. That unpredictability is exactly why emotional control matters so much. You cannot fully control the officer's behavior. You can control your own. Now here's something that catches even experienced drivers off guard. Silence can irritate officers over time. Not always, but sometimes. An officer asks multiple questions and receives repeated polite refusals to discuss travel details. Eventually the officer's tone hardens. "So you don't want to cooperate?" Notice the framing. Now the driver feels socially accused, even though remaining silent may be legally protected. This pressure causes many people to break composure after several minutes, especially when officers pause intentionally between questions. Silence from authority figures feels psychologically heavy. People rush to fill it, and when people start talking under pressure, accuracy drops dramatically. Another dangerous moment happens when drivers try to physically retrieve items unexpectedly. Registration in the glove box, insurance card under the seat, wallet in a back pocket. Without communication, sudden leaning and reaching can alarm officers fast. Simple narration helps. "My registration is in the glove compartment." Then move slowly. Again, this is not about surrendering dignity, it's about understanding perception during uncertain encounters. Now let's talk about passengers, because passengers often create hidden problems during traffic stops. One passenger starts recording aggressively while arguing. Another starts whispering nervously. Another interrupts questioning repeatedly. Officers now divide attention across multiple people, increasing tension and unpredictability. And passengers sometimes volunteer information drivers never intended to reveal. "I told him not to drive through here. We were only stopping for a minute. He doesn't usually get this nervous." Tiny comments, huge consequences sometimes. Passengers should understand that roadside conversations are not casual group discussions. Everything becomes observable information. Another misunderstood issue involves refusal itself. People online sometimes act like refusing requests automatically ends police interaction. Real life is messier. Refusal may prolong investigation if officers develop independent suspicion. Officers may call for canine units, additional officers, or further questioning, depending on circumstances and jurisdictional rules. That doesn't mean people should surrender rights automatically. It means drivers need realistic expectations instead of fantasy scenarios from social media clips. And speaking of canine units, many drivers completely misread what's happening when delays occur. They think, "Why am I still here?" The legal question often becomes whether officers are improperly extending the stop beyond its original purpose without adequate justification. But roadside timing feels very different from courtroom timing. 5 extra minutes can feel like half an hour under pressure, especially when officers intentionally keep interactions conversational. Now let me explain one subtle mistake that causes enormous problems. Nervous joking. People joke when uncomfortable. "Don't worry, there's no dead body in the trunk." Terrible idea. Officers hear bizarre things constantly and are trained not to dismiss unusual comments casually. Humor during high-stress police encounters often backfires badly because tone gets misread and statements get remembered literally. Another thing drivers rarely consider is how much officers observe before reaching the window. They may watch your mirror movements, your reaching patterns, passengers turning around, objects being hidden, phones being passed, movements inside the vehicle. So by the time first contact occurs, officers may already have formed preliminary impressions. And first impressions are powerful. A driver who immediately appears chaotic or frantic often faces a different interaction than one who appears controlled and predictable. Now here's a difficult truth. Sometimes perfectly innocent people still end up in terrible traffic stop situations. Miscommunication happens, bad assumptions happen, officer mistakes happen, driver mistakes happen. That's reality. But understanding traffic stop psychology dramatically reduces the odds of unintentionally making things worse. Because most roadside problems don't begin with dramatic criminal behavior. They begin with ordinary people reacting emotionally under stress. And the emotional pressure during stops is very real. The officer asks the same question again. You already answered. Now frustration builds. Your voice changes slightly. The officer notices instantly. What's with the attitude? Now the interaction becomes about demeanor as much as the original violation. This happens constantly. That's why controlled tone matters even when you feel irritated, insulted, or unfairly targeted, especially then. One final area people almost never prepare for is the moment after the stop appears finished. Adrenaline makes people careless afterward. They speed away angrily, forget turn signals, start yelling from the vehicle, drive recklessly. And yes, officers absolutely notice post-stop behavior. Some drivers even begin discussing illegal items openly while still within earshot or camera range because they think the encounter is over. Never assume the interaction mentally ends before it actually ends. Traffic stops are layered encounters. Observation continues longer than people realize. And maybe the most important thing to understand is this. Most police tricks during traffic stops are not movie-style traps. They are psychological shortcuts. Silence pressure, conversational momentum, social discomfort, repetition, tone shifts, implied authority, fatigue, nervousness, human instinct. That's why ordinary people fall into them every single day. Not because they're stupid, because they're human. And once you understand that, traffic stops start looking completely different. You stop seeing them as random conversations and start recognizing them as controlled environments where every word, pause, gesture, and reaction can change the direction of the encounter. The lights in the mirror still raise your heartbeat. That probably never changes completely. But the driver who understands the pressure is already in a far better position than the driver who walks into the stop emotionally unprepared, talking endlessly just to escape the silence while the officer quietly keeps watching, waiting, and listening for the one small mistake that changes everything.